Buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. If you agree, we'll begin with our committee meeting. So, again, good morning. This is our committee meeting on social affairs, youth and children, human exchanges and education and culture as part of EuroLat. I want to thank everyone who's here in this meeting. I'm glad that we have the diplomatic service here and representatives from other EU institutions and various other personalities. We also have representatives from the monitoring group of the EU Latin America follow-up from the Economic and Social Committee, who are permanent observers. This is laid down in Article 6.1 of the Rules of Procedure. And under Part 2 of Article 6, EESC representatives can take the floor, in line with the rules laid down by the President of the Assembly. As we're on European soil, the organization of the meeting is in line with the European component. It's so great to see you here in Madrid. We have interpretation available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. You can also speak but not listen to Italian. I'd also like to inform you that this meeting is web-streamed and will be recorded. The web stream will be published on our intranet and internet. After that brief introduction, we'll now turn to item 1, which is the adoption of the agenda. The agenda has been distributed to everyone who is a member of this committee. Can I check and see whether there's any comments? If there are no comments, then we consider the agenda approved. Now we move on to the next item, which is the election of the Bureau of this committee. As you know, we have to elect a Latin American co-chair and a Latin American vice-chair. Under the Rules of Procedure of the Assembly, in Annex 1, Article 3, Paragraph 2, it is stated that the committees will elect a bureau, which is composed of 2 co-presidents and 4 vice-chairs. For the Latin American side, we have the name of Adolfo Mendoza Legue from the Palandino Bolivian Parliament. Can we elect Mr. Mendoza Legue by acclamation? Mr. Carlen? I think it can just be done by a show of hands, by clapping. So, well done, Mr. Mendoza. Please come up to the top table with me so that you can share the co-chairing tasks with me.
Ahora pasamos a la elección.
We now have to elect a vice chair for the Latin American component. The Latin American side is proposing Ms. Marina Femenia from Parla Sur, Argentina. Can we proceed in the same way and elect her by acclamation? I think so. So, congratulations to Marina Femenia.
Enhorabuena. Continuamos con nuestros trabajos y pasamos ahora al
We continue with our work and go to item 3. This is to approve the minutes of the 1st of December 2022, held in Brussels. So you have the minutes among your papers. Are there any comments? No. If you want to change the minutes, then you need to send those changes to the Secretariat by email by 10 o'clock tomorrow. Otherwise, the minutes will be considered as approved. Now, item 4. Communications from the co-chairs. The first is about taking the floor. We have a limited amount of time for the meeting, but we have enough time to go through every single item on the agenda. So that we can have a smooth meeting, we suggest the following. Speakers, panelists will have 5 minutes for their initial presentation. Any other speaker will be given a maximum of 2 minutes. And the reason we're doing this is because of the interpretation. So, at the end of the meeting, interpretation will end, which is why we need to end on time. Of course, we have to get through everything on the agenda. So I count on you to stick to your speaking time. Now we move to item 5. This is a draft report. A draft report on bioregional cooperation for strengthening health systems and for access and distribution of vaccines and for scientific research against pandemics. I hope that everyone has received a copy of the report and the amendments. The report was presented in Brussels in December of last year. I'd now like to give the floor to the Latin American side for 2 minutes so that you can comment on any amendments that were put forward to the report. And you can touch on the most relevant parts, the most relevant points. I give the floor to my co-chair, Adolfo Mendoza Legue, for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, co-chair. I have to say that we have received a number of amendments. This illustrates the high level of interest for this subject and for what has happened on both sides, both continents, as regards the pandemic and as regards future-proofing against future pandemics and ensuring health in our systems. We pay tribute to the quality of the work, the quality of the comments of both components. In this regard, it's a pleasure for us to reconfirm the presentation of this proposal. In many areas, this report enjoys the support of the Latin American component. Thank you very much. The European rapporteur has not been able to attend. I would therefore like to ask whether anyone on the European side wants to speak on his behalf or wants to say anything about the amendments? It seems not. So we now vote on the text with the amendments that have been tabled. You should all have the voting list. So we will have a vote by raised hand. We start with Amendment 22. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Sorry, I think we need to count this one. Who is in favour of this amendment? Who's against? It's rejected. I got that one wrong, says the chair, sorry. Now, Amendment 23. Who's in favour? Against? Abstentions? Approved. Amendment 24. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Approved. Amendment 25. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 26. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 27. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 28. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 29. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 30. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 31. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 32. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 33. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 34. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 35. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 36. In favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. (37) in favour, against, abstentions, carried. 38 falls because we approved 37. So we jump to 39 in favour, against, abstentions, carried. Amendment 40, who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? If you don't mind, we're going to check because it wasn't obvious. Who's in favour of 40? 6 in favour. Who's against? Abstentions? Rejected. 41 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 42 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 43, who's in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Now we vote on the recitals. Amendment 1 has been withdrawn. As a result, we move to Amendment 2. Who's in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 3 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 4. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 5. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 6 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 7. 7 in favour. Against? Abstentions? Carried. 8, Amendment 8 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 9 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 10. You want 9 to be checked, do you? All right. We go back to Amendment 9 so as to check it. Who's in favour? 8 in favour. Against? 4 against. Abstentions? 4 abstentions. That means it is carried. There's no problem checking if there's any doubt. Now we move to Amendment 10 in favour. Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 11 in favour. Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 12 in favour. Against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 13, who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 14, who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 15, who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. That means that Amendment 16 falls. We move on to Amendment 17. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 18. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 18. Who's in favour? Sorry, 19. 19. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 20. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. Amendment 21. Who's in favour? Who's against? Abstentions? Carried. That means we have voted on all amendments. Now we have a final vote on the report with the changes caused by the amendments. So please keep your hand up, because we have to count exactly. Who's in favor of the report with the amendments that we've approved? Who's against? Abstentions? No abstentions. This means that with 17 in favor, 1 against and 0 abstentions, this report is approved for this committee. Let me congratulate those who drafted the report. If you want to table amendments for plenary, then you must do that by tomorrow at 3. In line with the rules of procedure, amendments to texts debated in the plenary session must be signed by at least 15 members of the Assembly. The presentation of the draft joint resolution to the plenary and the vote in plenary will take place on Thursday, the 27th of July, in line with the running order of the agenda of the plenary assembly. We now move to item 6 of the agenda. It is my pleasure to give the floor to my colleague so that he can lead, so that he can chair the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much. Indeed, we move on to item 6. This is a work document, or a working document, on measures for social mobility as an instrument to overcome poverty and social inequality in the Euro-Latin American Partnership in crisis contexts. The co-rapporteurs are as follows. For the European Parliament, we have José Manuel García Margallo. And then for the LAC side, we have MP Alejandro Toro. The document can be presented by the drafters. It's going to be presented by José Manuel García Margallo and Alejandro Toro. Well, the document has been sent around. There isn't a great deal of time to present it, however. However, we will start by giving the floor to the European component. So, you have 5 minutes to present the report or to present the document. After that, we'll hear from the Latin American side, who will have 5 minutes too. So I now give the floor to José Manuel García Margallo. Thank you very much, Chair. As you've received the document, you will be aware of it. This document looks at social mobility as a way of tackling poverty and social inequality on both sides, and this in the context of crisis. So we sketch out the situation. I will sketch out the situation in the EU in the first 2.5 minutes, and then I will look at cooperation. The first pillar, I just want to paint the following picture. The European Union, luckily, does boast a strong social support system. That's part of a free economic market. We have a neoliberal free market system. We call it the social market system. It's underpinned by two pillars: a functioning regulated market, which prevents the concentration of power, political power, and there is social freedom, which is extremely relevant. And then there's also social compensation and solidarity. And I think that social solidarity is the secular expression of Christian democratic support. So we also have a further pillar, which is the social welfare. And then we also saw Friedman, the Lehman Brothers crisis, all of which showed the need for public powers to intervene on the market when there are crises to help the most vulnerable. COVID further underscored this model. The European Central Bank wanted to take three measures. They wanted to keep interest rates low. The central bank wanted to buy assets and wanted to inject liquidity to ensure the solidity of the system. What the EU did during this time was three things. The EU established a safety net during the crisis to support those who had lost their jobs or who were at risk of losing their jobs. This was our so-called SURE program. We also have our stability mechanism, which was triggered. And then there was the Next Generation program, which is an EU program which adds to the EU budget and which will be paid off over time. It is unique. Now, all of this worked really well. Unemployment stood at 6%. It would have been 2 points higher without measures. It would have been worse in rural areas than urban areas. So job losses were much lower than feared. We've also managed to recover. And now the second point is about the bi-regional cooperation. You know that the EU is one of the biggest trading partners of Latin America. It's the biggest investor in Latin America and the biggest international donor too. We need to continue with cooperation along these lines, given our strong cultural ties, given our political ties, and given our economic ties. I hope that I stuck to the time. If I haven't, I thank the chair who allowed me to go on a little bit longer. I often do that. Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Even with the slight overrun, Mr. Garcia Margallo y Marfil, I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Toro. You have 5 minutes, sir. Of course, we will give you a slight overrun as well.
Gracias.
Thank you very much to our Bureau and to my co-rapporteur who presented things extremely well. Talking about social mobility and how to promote that in Latin America, I think we need to start by looking at where we stand. When it comes to Latin America, according to this study, what we see is that 55% of people living in poverty generate 10% of income, but the majority of that income is generated only by 10% of the people. So that means that there's a huge amount of wealth concentration. Some 10% of those in Latin America generate 75% of wealth. Well, they hold 75% of wealth in Latin America. Now, what's surprising is that 50% of the those that live in the most poverty only hold some 1% of wealth in Latin America. So that's where we stand. So what types of measures are we looking at in our working document? The first focuses on, and I'll look at the document and read through it really quickly. And the majority of you have seen this document, of course, and so the time is very short, and I know that you've all read it. Now, we have public policy here. What can be done over the long term? These are things that cannot take place just through specific interventions during some governments. We have to have a thematic approach. Education is a huge element. And then we have the fact that there is a huge gap between education in remote areas and in urban areas. In Colombia, for example, some primary students have some classrooms with 50 students or pupils with just one teacher, and that is often the case in these remote areas. Those in the urban areas, however, sometimes they have classrooms of 20, 25 pupils with several teachers. So in rural areas, we can see that there is a huge inequality. When it comes to nutrition as well, that is a huge point. We need to be able to support there too. Then there is the labor market. There are some parts of the population that struggle to access the labor market. For example, those from the Afro-descendant communities, indigenous populations, women, and those who live in the rural areas and in remote areas. That is why it's fundamental for governments and organizations aim to find a solution to support these groups. Finally, intergenerational mobility in the economic area. Now, one thing is sure. Almost every generation has seen an improvement in its lifestyle compared to previous generations. But what we have seen, nonetheless, is that some families need some 100 years to move out of poverty and into a middle class. Therefore, I should like to put two questions to you for the purposes of our thought process, so that we can better home in on what we need to do. And I'd like to congratulate the European Parliament, but the European Parliament's rapporteur for underscoring what Europe has been able to do to improve and what we still have to do in Latin America. We know that private business must do more than just pay taxes, because frequently the tax bill for these companies are much lower, and that there's also the political clout related to that. Therefore, what we want to know is look at how we can close this educational, training, and nutritional poverty gap that perpetuates inequality. Second, it is definitely true that where you are born has a huge impact on who you are and what your life looks like in the future. And how can we look at that? Thank you. Now, I'd like to give the floor to any members of this parliament that would like to make a comment or raise a question on this report.
Diputado, adelante.
Go ahead. 2 minutes.
Sí, creo que
I believe that it is vital that we discuss this item. This item in particular is crucial because it comes down to the ability of peoples and communities to develop. We know that we've had a general crisis in Latin America. Of 10 pupils, for example, only 4 finish primary or secondary education, so huge dropout rates, and then that has a knock-on effect later. So it's fundamental to look at this. Also, we know that we have a great opportunity to share experience, best practices, initiatives, factoring in what our rapporteur said when it comes to the difficulties of development. We will not be able to develop our communities if we're not able to also develop our economic possibilities within a radius of 300 kilometers, and that also will require having good connectivity, telecommunications, excellent education that is brought to these remote areas. It's going to be very hard to fight poverty if we're not able to make sure to bring the primary sector to these places, and that's going to be a huge part of our steps in the process of development. Thank you, Mr. Carlin from Mercosur. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Escobar from Palasan. Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Much along the same lines as those who have spoken before me, when it comes to this issue of emerging from poverty and fighting inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean, in our region, as has been stated clearly via the figures that were put forth about the great inequality that exists in our countries, in my country, in Guatemala, for example, more than 60% of the population is from indigenous populations, and they live in remote areas. And we, in those areas, have deplorable circumstances. No schools, for example. During the pandemic, during COVID-19, we saw this all the more. Access to digital services and technology was basically non-existent for our pupils and students, not just in Guatemala, but in many countries of the region, some more than others. But whatever the case may be, the problem existed. The digital hasn't arrived, and this explains the impact of the pandemic on poverty, and that has been far-reaching in our countries. Therefore, later on in the meeting, I will make a proposal, but I did want to highlight this delay for our students and understanding the fact that this is going to be a major point that we'll have to address if we're going to be able to reduce poverty. Thank you very much. Now, it would be good to focus primarily on the subject at hand by the rapporteurs, put forth by the rapporteurs. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Bermudez.
Margarita de la Pisa.
And Ms. Margarita de la Pisa.
Adelante.
2 minutes for both.
Gracias, buen día.
Go ahead, Mr. Bermudez. Thank you very much. This is a subject indeed that has an impact not just on Latin America and education, but I think it's definitely a subject that members of Parliament both in Latin America and Europe have to face. We need to find a way for cooperation, therefore, in this fundamental area of education. I'd like, therefore, to call on the European Parliament in the area of cooperation. Inequality, as my colleagues lawmakers that are here today, in these remote areas, in these rural areas, in Latin America and the Caribbean, falls very short of what you have in education in Europe, where you have a more homogeneous situation. I listened very carefully to many of the citizens in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it feels as if this is an existential issue, because what you have by way of education can limit very much what one can do. And in specifically in this committee, what we're talking about education, I think we can see a major area for cooperation using European educational models that would assist us in closing this inequality and this gap. Those who have that have the least are those that have the least access to education too. Go ahead, madam. Thank you very much. anything that contributes to social mobility and education, public health, and individuals, and job growth. These are things that we applaud. What is fundamental is that we have to find a way for people to be able to express their calling with the common good of society at heart. And that is necessary in all areas, specifically in the most remote areas. It's important to come up with policy that protects the family. That is the fundamental point for assisting people in developing and promoting their growth and fostering the best society that we have. The family is not an end, but a way to also achieving all of this. When there is a shortage, for example, we need to find a way to address that so that every family can find a way to its own subsistence. Now, we also need to do this via financial and economic support to be able to generate wealth and economic growth of society. When it comes to discrimination, we should not fall into the trap of ideology or gender. We must look at family, knowing that that is a way of legitimizing a woman, and that at times this concept is very much distorted. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we are looking at social mobility to find a way to move beyond inequality. If there are no further requests for the floor at this time, we know that there are members of the Economic and Social Committee that have been invited. Would any of them like to take the floor on this subject matter at this time?
Adelante, por favor.
Go ahead for 2 minutes, please.
Gracias.
Yes. From the European Economic and Social Committee, we, in the follow-up committee, looked into everything that is being done in EuroLat in this committee and in the Parliamentary Assembly. We look very much at issues related to education, and we are supporting very much any cultural and educational exchanges within the context of the Erasmus program. We believe that in the future we should be able to avail more of the global gateway, and we will present the opportunities that exist therein. We believe that digital literacy is something that is extremely important, so current school curricula must be updated to include this. In Europe, we're currently ongoing many reforms in the educational sector. We hope that in the future, this new curriculum will mean that there are quality courses available in the digital area and cyber professions. This is extremely important for all. I'm from Romania, and we have a huge challenge, how we can shift from the old system to the new system, and how we can promote new types of educational methods to be able to update our teaching to current requirements. Thank you. Thank you very much.
A continuación,
Now, we will give the floor for 2 minutes to our co-rapporteurs on this subject, such that they can comment on this first stage of the exchange of views and parliamentary deliberation. First, the European Parliament rapporteur. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for the quality of their comments and their considerations, and underscoring the relative level of poverty in Latin America, and that the situation has deteriorated in the post-COVID-19 phase, with an increase also of energy prices as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. The poverty rate increased. 17 million live in poverty, And we've also seen that there has been a further increase, showing that education is a fundamental issue to be addressed for fighting poverty. When we look at the huge gap that exists in the urban areas and rural areas, now that exists in Europe, but that is heightened in Latin America, and also that really leads us to understand the importance of cooperation between Latin America and Europe in this area with exchanges of teachers, pupils. This should address this inequality that exists, that is the root cause of many of the political movements that we have seen emerge in Latin America. With poverty levels, democracy suffers. Therefore, we need to be able to find that equality amongst people. Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia Margallo y Marfil. I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Toro. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to also refer to the extremely important and interesting comments that were made, and focusing specifically on education. But we know that for education, we need resources to be able to resolve the problem. Therefore, it is important to go beyond this, to look at grants and new types of concessional finance for this purpose. In Colombia and other cases, we have an exchange of debt for shares in climate change to assist in investing in education to be able to close this huge gap that leads only to further inequality. Thank you very much. Thank you to you as well. Thank you to Ms. de la Pisa, Mr. Escobar, Ms. Escobar, Mr. Carlin, and to our colleagues from the European Economic and Social Committee. We would like to congratulate our co-rapporteurs and point to the fact that now we are going to move to the next stage of the process, and that is to the drafting of the joint document. If there's nothing else to be said under this item, then we will move to item 7 of our agenda. Item 7, topic for debate: cooperation and dialogue in the construction of comprehensive care systems in the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. We will go straight to the debate on this subject matter. I'd like, therefore, to, by way of introduction to the subject, we will have presentations from two individuals: Andrea Costa Freda, Program Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, Oxfam Intermon, and Juan José Leal Martinez, who is in charge of the Conventions of Cooperation in the field of education organization of Iberoamerican States for Education, Science, and Culture. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation to this meeting and for giving us a presentation on the subject. We will now give you speaking time. We'll begin by giving the floor to Ms. Andrea Costa Freda for 8 minutes for a brief introduction to the subject that we are focusing on here. Go ahead, please, Madam Costa Freda. Thank you very much to the Bureau and to the chairs. It is an honor and a pleasure from civil society and from Latin America to be here today. I'd like to speak on behalf of Oxfam. It is an international organization in more 70 countries, and we have a network of CARES, Cuidados, Bolivia, Colombia, Spain, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay, and CLACSO, which is a regional network made up of academics, the township of Barcelona, for example, and this was established within the context of the a European Union project. Now, I'd like to use this opportunity that we see at this time, where we're having a reinvigoration of exchanges between Latin America and Europe, and we'd like to maintain this dialogue along the lines of what came out of the statement of the EU-CELAC summit, to make sure that we can keep on the agenda those things that we have been calling for from civil societies from the very outset, from UN Women, for example. We would like to have an interregional pact for care, and along the lines of the Buenos Aires commitment that took place, that came out of the meeting in Buenos Aires. And according to the social forum and trade unions, that the statement that was published prior to the EU-CELAC summit. Now we know what we need to do goes beyond investing, like Global Gateway does, in roads and in IT systems. If we look at what we have, we need to strengthen our strategic alliance to come up with an agenda that fights inequality and the culture of privilege. We believe that it is important to put life at the heart and to make sure that we move towards a society of healthcare. This will assist us in strengthening our productive systems, because it will undo the inequalities that women face with this. Now, when it comes to the health and equality agenda, we have several crises ongoing. And in this context, what we can see is that there is a real structural crisis. Health care. When the world stopped those who depended on others, who needed care, young people, the elderly, they continued to need care. And 80% of that care falls on the shoulders of women. It is important, therefore, to look at this agenda as a structural agenda that has an impact on intersectionality. Now, this is based on inequality. Those who have the worst positions in the power system, women, those from racial communities, and the most vulnerable, suffer from this the most. And in Spain, what we see under paragraph 30, we can hear that there's nothing that is needed more than those who need care. But there are huge inequalities when it comes to access to that care. Care is something that is managed by underprivileged communities for privileged communities. We've seen that those who are vulnerable, the racialized communities, the indigenous communities, the global north and the global south, there is a huge imbalance there. And what we can see is that there's an enormous imbalance between Latin America and the European Union that we need to underscore. I'd like to look at a Peruvian writer living in Madrid, and she states, well, in her book, my professor in Peru, the one that explained to me all of the basics of science, underscored very much the fact that there was this inequality between Spain and Latin America. But what we can see is that we must focus on feminism and rights. And what is important is that there are two big conflicts. There is the sexual vision, or the gender vision of word, and the distributive conflict. That it comes from the dichotomy between production and reproduction. In other words, that there is an accumulation of capital and sustaining life. In this current time, there is no collective responsibility that makes sure that life is maintained. We have health care that is private, that is carried out by women, and that is invisible. So what we need to do is make sure that we reverse this, where there is co-responsibility, making sure that this is looked at in households with resources. Well, right now what we see is that women take care of these things at home with either their own money to pay for that assistance, or because they have to pay for it with their own free time. So the fact that there is a market approach, the fact that women have to provide much of this care, it shows that this type of care is a privilege and not a right. I'd like to conclude with two further points when it comes to the agenda for care and the two on this agenda. So in terms of the Mercosur feminist agenda, what we have seen is that there is a call that there is going to be no change in healthcare if we don't have a paradigm shift, because everything that happens continues to contribute to what is in place now. A cultural change, therefore, that will shift the balance between men and women and generations. It is extremely difficult to imagine this continuation of the productive life and reproductive life. That is something that absolutely is going to have to be addressed. When it comes to the conservative approaches that continues to focus the right to care in families and in women, that has to change. Now, who is going to change the rights in these integrative systems for health in Europe and more specifically in Latin America? Now, we know in Latin America there are many tax systems that are very restrictive. We know that there is much debt because of the COVID-19 crisis and the crisis because of the invasion of Ukraine. Who will continue to pay for these integrative health systems? In Europe, what we can see is that this comes down to public investment. We cannot leave it to private investment. The global gateway, the response for Latin America from the EU is the global gateway, which comes down to private investment. What we need is tax agreements, international cooperation for the Society of Healthcare. I should like to conclude by stating that what we need to be able to do is make sure that this healthcare is very much at the top of the, or that the care system is very much at the top of the agenda in our cooperation, in our relations, because we need to do much more than just build roads and infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Costa Freda. Our other guest isn't here. However, we do have Juan José Leal Martínez, who is responsible for cooperation agreements in the field of education, science and culture for the Organization of Ibero-American States. Mr. Leal Martínez, you have the floor for 8 minutes. Thank you very much for having accepted to speak to us today. Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who's here and who's following on the web stream. So, I'm here from the OEI, and I'm going to tell you a bit about our experience and the exchanges we've had with different ministers and what we've been doing at regional level. So we've been working with education ministries, and we have some 75 years of experience in this field. I just wanted to apologize on behalf of our Director General, who wanted to be here, but who has other engagements. And as a result, our Director General can't be here. However, I send their apologies. So let me tell you a bit about what the Organization of Ibero-American States for Education, Science and Culture does, and why are we relevant? Well, we know that there was the recent EU-CELAC summit, So there, at that summit, we committed to further cooperation. We have shared responsibilities, values, and interests. We've committed to working together. So this is the starting point. And now let me talk about persons in a situation of vulnerability. They're mentioned in the CELAC Declaration, and then mobilizing funding for those people is mentioned as well. Then another important issue for us is the SDGs and Agenda 2030. So we're trying to work towards greater sustainability. And today it's also important to link to the issue of education, making education inclusive, and we need to promote opportunities for everyone throughout their life. Let me just say that I've gathered some information, and I was reading that the care deficit is a real issue throughout the world, but particularly in the Latin American and Caribbean regions. It's due to various issues. So here we're talking in particular about rural areas. And we have different levels of formality and informality in care, and different scopes. So what is care? And what is care policy? The aim of care is to provide support and care for those persons who need it, and all underlying policies. Then there's the issue of redistributing care. You know, as we've been talking about this morning, how do we link care to education? When we're talking about care, we have to look at the care system, and we also have to look at the education system. Investing in care and in education has a multiplying effect. It improves welfare. If you don't provide care, if you don't provide education, it further entrenches inequality and poverty. Without care provision, without education, you cannot close the various gaps that we've heard about this morning. Now, it's difficult to talk about all the work we do as an organization and all the work we've done over the years. And it's difficult to talk about that in just 5 minutes. But on care, we've identified 3 points. One important point on care is inclusion. Another issue is the elderly and older people who need care. Then there's also younger people who need care. So on inclusion, we're looking at care through a political prism. We're helping to define care and define education so as to ensure greater education and inclusion. And we're also doing a great deal of work, but in recent years, we have drawn up recommendations with our different partners and countries. So there are 5 things we need to do. We need to have greater awareness of existing education inequalities. Then we need to create regional networks. We need to create evaluating and monitoring mechanisms. That includes for children and elderly people. Then we also need to have alliances with international organizations. We, in the OEI, work on this. Then another thing we need to do is involve civil society, academia, and private and public organizations. Now, the subject of elderly people. Well, some people have spoken about the need for greater digital literacy, and we, as the OEI, want greater digital literacy for elderly people. We want that for adults. We want to create specific recommendations and measures for that. Now, of the three, there are 3 major points, 3 major areas that we work on, and the final point is about childhood. In basically all of the countries we work with, we see that there are care programs. The most extensive are care services for younger children, in particular those who are in a vulnerable position. Now, in rural areas, we have a great deal of studies which show that we need to invest more if we're going to have growth. There are many studies which show this. Many studies show just how important it is to invest in care. We, in our organization, have established a network of childcare providers, and that network aims to increase capacity. It focuses on policy for young children, and we also are continuing to focus on the Agenda 2030. Now, by way of conclusion, we in our organization do a great deal of work in many countries, and we also provide advanced technical assistance. So the ministries have approved our budget, and we are trying to strengthen multilateralism so as to deal with social challenges, so as to promote exchanges and best practices. And what we're doing is ensuring that different countries play a greater role in international cooperation. Of course, we are trying to support the digital, environmental, and social economic transition. We're also trying to look at existing global agreements and promote new ones, and we try to improve and create spaces for dialogue. You know, we've been talking a lot about how we can ensure that public and private work together. Well, we want to do everything so that that can happen. Thank you very much. We hope that everything you've been talking about can feed into the work of the co-rapporteurs. I'd now like to give the floor to MPs and MEPs who wish to take the floor. And now I give the floor to Margarida de la Pisa Carrión, then Ms. González, then MP Carlen, then MEP Rodriguez. You each have 2 minutes. Please go ahead. That was very interesting. The focus was put on a very important subject. We have to recognize the right to receive care. We also have to recognize that there is the right to provide care when it is needed. We have all needed care at one point in our life. We will need care, and we will all provide care to another. It should not be a luxury, but a natural response. We need to have social and institutionalized care. But whenever care can be provided, it should be provided by family, in the household. The household is where everything happens. Nothing can replace care, affection, the care provided by family. As I've said earlier, family is a way to reduce inequality. And families are an advantage that everyone should enjoy. We need to give more respect to families and provide support for families. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Ms. González. Thank you, Co-Chair. It was a real pleasure to listen to this, and I'm so glad that this item was on the agenda. Thank you, Ms. Costa Freda. Ms. Costa Freda, you have provided a roadmap for us. I think that the Latin American parliaments are looking at these various issues. I was able to be there when the Buenos Aires Declaration on Care was discussed, and it's so good that there is full public funding for the strengthening of cooperation instruments at the international level. So, of course, that includes the classical instruments. Of course, we're in favor of Global Gateway as an investment package, but we think that the European Commission and others should continue to step up cooperation. I'm talking about EuroSocial, Spotlight, and the broader package. This looks at the governance framework in the Latin American states. I think that care should be included as a priority. So I really want to thank Ms. Costa Freda. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say because it will inspire us when we speak. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Carlen from the Mercosur side. This subject requires a lot of work. We in the Mercosur Parliament are focusing on the creation of an observatory on migration because migration is one of the toughest issues we're facing in South America. In recent months, we've had a major migration issue. Many from Chile who wanted to return to their countries at the Bolivian border. I think this all boils down to the fact that we have many people, millions of people who are impoverished. Many are children who require care. 45% of those who are above the age of 65 don't have a basic income, so they can't support themselves. They are under the poverty line, living under the poverty line, these elderly people. We therefore really need to work hard on this issue. You in Europe have the issue of an aging population, more and more elderly people, whereas we in Latin America have more abandoned children. So we in Argentina and elsewhere do have social security for elderly people. Then in our Ministry for Social Affairs, we've also been looking at how to provide support and care for younger people. You know, sometimes we see that there is psychological, physical, economic, or material abuse. But there's also abandonment of elderly people. There's a lack of attention and a lack of dignity and respect granted to elderly people. You know, it's similar to young people who can't get an education, who can't develop their lives, who can't evolve, who are deprived of opportunities. But it's so important that we counter that. You know, if you've got children under the age of 3, they're marked from an early age. But we need to ensure that children do have the right to education. They must have opportunities for the future. So I'm so glad that we've spoken about this issue, and we will be striving to find policies that deal with these issues. Thank you very much, Honourable Member. I also want to thank colleagues who, well, I'd like to thank colleagues and say to colleagues, please don't have private conversations while we're holding the debate. Now I give the floor to colleague Rodriguez. Thank you very much, Chair. This is a fundamental issue. the issue of care provision is so important in order to protect the most vulnerable. Doesn't matter whether it's due to your age, your growth, or where you were born, or whether it's due to your social economic situation. We need to have a care provision system which covers all stages of life. We in Uruguay boast a good care system for children from the ages of 0 to 3. It's a state system and which goes back to a law of 1986 which establishes centres and nurseries for children. It's a way of protecting the most vulnerable, but hand in hand with their children. So it provides care for children, but it also provides support for families. It helps provide support for families. But it's not enough. You know, we see a great deal of poverty among children from the ages of 0 to 3, and it's an issue that affects not just Uruguay, but other Latin American countries. Care is also a state responsibility, but we also need to work on strategic alliances with private companies and with social entities powered by civil society. That's why it's so important that we have bi-regional funds which will support the establishment of networks. It's also important, as others have said, to evaluate the design of policies. Our countries are facing a major challenge currently and for future generations. It's about providing opportunities to ensure better opportunities for every single citizen. Thank you very much. I don't think anyone else wants to take the floor. So to round off, we'll give the floor to our co-chair, Ms. Rodriguez. Thank you very much, everyone, for the excellent presentations. Thank you, Ms. Costa Freda. Thank you, Mr. Leal. I welcome the fact that we in this committee can look at care systems. We want to maintain them and further improve them over time. There's no doubt the pandemic made something clear. It brought something to light that already existed. When everything was paralyzed, everything happened in the household, in hospitals, in care homes, in retirement homes. And who was dealing with all of those situations? Women. It was women who were looking after the young people, the elderly people, and the sick people. In Spain, around 80% of nurses are women, about 90% of midwives are women. And there's also a lot of informal care provision. We've often ignored care. Care provision has never been included in GDP. It's often been invisible and hidden. Of course, the circumstances are different in Latin America. There's the issue of care, domestic work, and I would say that women generally look after elderly people. 80% of that work, 82% of that work is done by women. And care is such an informal profession. So I really welcome the fact that we're talking about care provision. It's up to society and it's up to the public administration to also provide care. Care should be a provision where you need a good qualification, but it's also an important work sector. Care is a very important work sector. But we have to make the care sector, we have to make care workers who are so essential, we have to make them less informal. We have to take them out of the informal sector. We must continue to talk about these care workers. So these workers who are essential shouldn't be working in informal sectors. And most of these care workers are female workers, are women workers who have been doing this work, but their work wasn't recognized. You know, I'm thinking about my mother and my mother's generation. And you know, people would say to her, "Do you have a job?" And she would say, "Oh, I don't work." Well, I work at home. But it was work, but it wasn't remunerated, but it wasn't considered essential. But it is essential, and care work is essential. So, thank you very much, and this is a topic that we must continue to talk about. I don't think there were any questions for our guests, but they can make a final statement. 2 minutes each. We'll switch it around this time. We'll start with Mr. Leal Martinez, and then we'll hear from Ms. Costa Fleda. Go ahead, sir. Thank you so much. I'll just build on what has been said in the last few speeches. Of course, care is a great deal of work. We need to have a lot of work together and coordination on this work. Still on the subject of care provision, there are various factors at play. So how do we ensure that this is a job of high quality? It's not just about formal or informal. And then we also need to look at care as a fourth pillar alongside the other pillars of education, health, education. Then another important issue is diversifying funding sources. So that's really important, to have the necessary funding sources and to invest better. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Bureau and the co-chairs. Let me just say a word about co-responsibility and sharing of responsibility when it comes to care. Often there is a divide in the discourse. There's the role that families can play when it comes to care. Just want to quote Silvia Federici. I think she put it well. Care isn't work. It isn't love, it's work. Sorry, care is work. Care is invisible work. If you calculate domestic work, and if you calculate non-remunerated care, it accounts for a quarter of GDP. Unpaid care is a quarter of GDP. Then if we look at integrative care systems, this is up to the state. There needs to be public leadership. I think we in Latin America have learned a lot of lessons. I think the EU needs to learn lessons now too. How do you involve local communities and civil society when it comes to care provision and integrative care provision services? What we've seen in Latin America is that sometimes public leadership is lacking at local, regional, or national level. And then you have local care organizations which involve civil society. Those local care organizations stepped up and ensured sustainable care provision. And then there's also the social side of care provision. You know, it shouldn't just be the converted who talk about the right to social care. Others should be talking about the right to social care. Now let me just say a few words about cooperation between the EU and Latin America. In the EU, we can learn a great deal from Uruguay, from Colombia, from Bolivia. We need to have a second look at cooperation between our two sides. We need to look at the European care strategy. If we want to improve access to this right, then we need to take a good look at what our Latin American partners have done, because our Latin American partners have been pretty innovative when it comes to integrated care provision. There's a bit of a triangular system. The EU often thinks that it is the donor and that the Latin American side is the recipient. No, it's not like that with knowledge. It has to be a circular provision of knowledge. I think that care is an area where we have very fertile ground and where we can cooperate differently. Thank you very much to the two of you. It goes without saying that this issue is not just about inclusion. It's a geopolitical issue. And it would raise the profile of an important issue. And we need to foster structural change in care in our states. So this is a very rich discussion which will feed into further discussions as we seek out structural reform. So we would like to thank our experts and everyone. So that brings us to the end of this particular item of the agenda. So we'll now move to the next item, agenda item 8.
And for that purpose, I will be giving the presidency back to our co-chair so that she can carry out this item in perfect order. Indeed, thank you very much. That brings us to the 8th item of our agenda. On this item, what the committee needs to do now is to come up with a subject for a future report, as well as a debate topic for forthcoming committee meetings. If you agree, I should like to make a proposal. As a subject for our next report, I wondered if perhaps we could continue with the debate that we just concluded, i.e., cooperation and dialogue in the construction of comprehensive care systems in the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. I do believe that every single person here has expressed the importance of this subject, and therefore it would be worthwhile to continue working on it, be above and beyond this exchange that we had with our experts during this meeting, as good as that exchange was. So if the committee were to agree, then I would like to suggest that we take this subject, the one that we just debated, as the subject for our next and future report. I can see people nodding their heads in agreement, therefore we will adopt this subject for our upcoming report. The next subject that we need to address is what the topic will be for our next meeting. Today, for example, as you know, we had 2 experts and we had a topic for debate for today. So we need one for the next meeting. And there is a proposal on this. It was pending from our December meeting. I shall put it to you, and then others can, of course, raise further points for topic of debate. This was labor and social rights and the labor market towards an additional agenda. This is the suggested subject, but we left it pending at our last meeting. Shall we keep this, or would there be someone here, one of our colleagues, that would like to put forth a different subject for a potential topic? Ms. Escobar, please.
Gracias.
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair. We have spoken much about education. I wonder if we had contemplated the possibility of having education as a topic for debate. I would suggest that we could have a debate on the impact of COVID-19 the impact of that on education for young girls and boys in Latin America and possible way forward to undoing that impact. So that would be a subject on education, and we have brought education up on more than one occasion, so I think it would be good to address that. Yes. Now, if you allow, the last committee report was on education, and therefore, to a certain degree, we have looked at the impact of the pandemic and the fact that education in formal settings was put on hold during that. Therefore, that report was adopted at the last meeting. Thank you. If there are no other proposals, then we could maintain the subject that we debated today, to come up with, we could use this subject as the labor market and labor and social rights and a complementary agenda or an additional agenda. Would you agree then that we keep this as our topic for debate? We can find experts to invite, as we have in previous meetings. Very good. I believe that brings us to item 9. So any other business, we are going to be able to conclude on time, it looks, and that's excellent news. Any other business? If there are no items to be raised under any other business, then let's move to item 10. Date and time and place of next meeting of our Committee on Social Affairs, Youth and Children, Human Exchanges, Education and Culture. We will let you know when that meeting will take place, where and when. That brings me to the conclusion then, and just I'd like to thank everyone for your active participation, for your attendance, and the chair thanks the technical team for organizing this meeting in this beautiful room here in the Spanish Senate, and the chairwoman also kindly thanks the interpreters for their work. Thank you very much, and I would like to adjourn the meeting. Thank you, co-chair. If you would allow, I should like to make a suggestion. When we look at labor and social rights and the labor market, let us not fail to look at the complementary agenda, i.e., the fact that we have 2 regions and Latin America and the Caribbean and Europe should work together. And then we also have other aspects. For example, the issue of care has an impact on social aspects on the labor market. So we shouldn't fail to look at the issue of equality in terms of representation, but also in specific parts of our social realm. So those who begin to work on this subject, we should look at, for example, these comprehensive care systems with linking up to this aspect of the social labor rights and the labor market. Thank you very much. The meeting stands adjourned.